see the background of Mr. Damaso. While I introduce who he is and what he does, Alina and Pui, you can test out your live function now. So yeah, Mr. Damaso, he is the founder of Clarify.Media, and he has been a journalist and photographer for over 20 years, actually. So his work has been published by numerous newspapers around the world, which includes the prominent ones like New York Times, Associated Press, Wall Street Journal, and so on. So he's also a award winner for multiple amazing, prestigious awards. Yeah, without further ado, I'm just going to pass it on to Mr. Damaso. So Mr. Damaso, if you have a slide to share, you can take over the sharing now. Damaso, I think you're muted.
Thank you so much for giving the introduction. I really appreciate it. And I am going to now share my screen. I think you have to allow me to share my screen. I think it's disabled for some reason.
Can you share now?
No, it still says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Just hang on. Can someone just set the maestro as the co-host, whoever that is the host actually? Yeah. Okay, Damaso, you are co-host today. Yep. All good.
Okay, thank you very much. Selamat malam. I hope that you guys have had a good day today. I'm sure that you've been learning a lot, and I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you. I think we're gonna hopefully cover some interesting material and learn a little bit more about why media, especially news media, is so important. I'm just gonna share a little bit of information about the organization that I wrote with the News Literacy Project. You can visit their website at newslit.org and find a lot of information, including resources that you can use in your classroom. You can also follow the News Literacy Project on Facebook and on Twitter as well. You can follow me on Twitter. We post a lot of information around journalism and around media literacy, so we'll hopefully find that interesting. Just a little bit more background: the News Literacy Project is a nonpartisan NGO. It's actually based in the United States, and the whole goal is to create programs and resources to help educators teach news literacy and media literacy, and that's why I'm here with you today. And as David mentioned, I am a journalist. I was born in New York, but I've worked all over the world, including your neighbors in Indonesia and Rwanda and Tanzania, and throughout Europe as well. So let's talk about media, and let's talk about media within the context of Malaysia. So when we talk about media, we're talking about all information. We're talking about a meme you might see on social media. We're talking about an advertisement you might hear on the radio. Music is media. Social media is obviously media. And in Malaysia, you are very well connected to each other and to the rest of the world. You have more mobile phone connections than you have population, right? Some people have 2 mobile phones, like me, and a large number of your population is connected to the internet. 83%, that's a very high number. And 81% of the entire population of Malaysia is active on social media. That's a very, very high number. So you guys are using media, you're connected to the internet, you're also using social media at very high rates. And you spend a lot of time on social media, about almost 3 hours. And these numbers will be much higher for your students and for the young people in your lives. This is sort of an aggregate of adults between 16 and 64. But the average Malaysian spends almost 8 hours a day on the internet. So You guys are using social media a lot, you're using the internet, but the question becomes how much of that time is spent getting information, right? We talk about media within this very broad umbrella of encompassing every kind of information, but not every source of information, not every piece of information you see on the internet is high quality. So let's talk a little bit more about news, and specifically why news is important within the context of democracy. So in order to have a participatory democracy, you need accurate information. Democracy is based on the idea that the people in the democracy, the voters, the citizens, will make informed decisions on who to vote for, what party, what candidate to support. It's impossible to do that if you don't have high quality information. Information beyond the civic world, it just provides the bedrock, the grounding, the foundation for everything that we understand around the world. Unless you see it, you're learning about things, events from other people, from other sources, right? And we live in our lives, we might spend time in one particular city or one part of one city. So how do we know about the world outside of what we can directly observe? Well, that comes through media, it comes through information. But are those sources of information reliable? Information determines how we look at social issues, how we, as voters, decide who to support, and it helps us form our opinions. So again, this is the basis, this is the foundation of how we're going to interact with the world. And it's the raw material, right, of how we make decisions. So it's one thing to have an opinion about someone or opinion about a particular political party. The decision to vote for that party is the next step. But again, the foundation of that is information. And if you have low quality information, you're going to make low quality choices. So one of the things that I think is really important for us to understand and for us to communicate to our students is this concept that quality journalism is essential to holding powerful people and institutions accountable for their actions. Democracy is based on the idea of checks and balances so that one part of the political system doesn't become too powerful or feels as though it can act without any consequences. Once that happens, once that misalignment takes hold, it's very hard for a democracy to function properly. And the whole goal of democracy is to represent the interests of the citizens, not just a certain part of the citizenry, not just powerful interests, but everyone who makes up the civic life of the country. So we're going to look at some recent examples of how that's happened. Obviously, in the United States, where I'm from, we have a very robust news media that is constantly asking questions of politicians and holding them accountable. Before I was born, President Nixon was forced to resign his office and leave office because of the work of two famous in America journalists, Woodward and Bernstein, who worked for a newspaper called the Washington Post. They exposed the scandal in which the president was involved, and he was forced to resign because the information came out because journalists uncovered it and published it. Recently in Malaysia, one of your news organizations did a look back at the last year of COVID in Malaysia. And one of the things they pointed out was that the elections were a super spreader event, holding the government accountable. Now, what's interesting about this is when they originally published it, they didn't include that particular piece of information, but they were held accountable as well. So one thing that's important to recognize is the public has a responsibility to hold journalists accountable and make sure journalists are upholding the standards that they should be in their profession. Most of you probably know the 1MD else. And the information came out that this money that was the money coming from the citizens of Malaysia and belonged to the Malaysian people was being misused, or allegedly being misused at that time. And the prime minister was charged with money laundering. And earlier this year, the prime minister was convicted. But before that, the party that had held power for since independence for more than 60 years lost its hold on government because of the work that journalists did in trying to hold powerful people to account. This doesn't happen in countries that don't have a robust free press. Media, specifically news media, has a really important role in a democratic society to represent the interests of powerful people. When you have a really good and well-functioning government, the government should be able to hold itself accountable. Unfortunately, even in the most evolved democracy, that often doesn't happen because people in government are appointed by their friends or people who know them, and they expect support in return. So sometimes you need sources outside the government, specifically journalists, to hold people accountable. But as I said earlier, when we talk about media, we're not just talking about journalism. We're talking about all sorts of information, including, unfortunately, misinformation. And as we saw earlier, Malaysians, as well as people all around the world, spend a lot of time on social media, and there is a lot of low quality information and even what we would call misinformation or disinformation that permeates the world on social media. So, but why is this a problem? Why does it matter if somebody believes that vitamin C is a cure for coronavirus, which of course it is not? Well, the problem is that misinformation has real world consequences. And this is something that's really important to communicate to your students. As you guys know, young people have a really hard time understanding that their actions have consequences, right? This is one of the things that you as parents and teachers probably spend a lot of time talking to your students and your children about. But let's step back a moment. How do you get to the point of making a bad decision? Well, usually it starts with poor information. And those bad decisions can then lead to dangerous actions. So using some examples from the United States recently, once the coronavirus began spreading in the United States, people use that as an excuse to assault people of Asian descent and people from Asia within the United States. People would see something on social media saying that this virus is from China and Chinese people are responsible for its spread, and they would then attack businesses and attack people. And this didn't just happen in the United States, this also happened in the UK and other countries around the world. But that misinformation created fear, and that fear led people to take an illegal and dangerous action and hurt real people. Most of you are probably aware of the attack that happened in Washington, D.C. earlier this month. Most of those people came to Washington, D.C., came to this protest based on misinformation. They were told falsely that their candidate did not win, they actually won the election, and the election was being stolen, and that the only way that they could have the outcome they wanted was by attacking the capital of the United States as the counting of the electoral college vote was happening. People would read something on social media or an internet forum, and then they got on a bus, got on a plane, got in a car, drove to Washington, and some of those people participated in a violent assault on the very foundation of American democracy. And it was a very scary thing to watch as I was watching in real time. I was not there, but I was watching on TV. It's hard to believe that this would happen in the United States, but No country, no people are immune to the effects of misinformation. In Malaysia, misinformation, especially on Facebook, around the Rohingya, are leading to attacks and leading to persecution of these people. Again, this is misinformation. So information, including misinformation, shapes the way we see each other, the way we see the society around us. And it's impossible to be active and fully engaged if you're not a critical consumer of information, right? And this is why we're here today. This is why you're here today and tomorrow, is to learn how to teach these skills to your students. And it's very important because, as we said earlier, there's a lot of information, right? Media is a big word, and it encompasses everything from advertising to entertainment to opinion to news. But we have to help our students understand the difference between different types of information. And the way that we do that is through media literacy, news literacy, education. And this is really, this skill, the skill to be able to tell the difference between what's real and what's false. The skill of being able to critically interpret information is really the skill of being a citizen in the 21st century. And so if your students don't have this skill, they can't be fully active and engaged participants in your society. So we really feel that young people have a right. It's not just a privilege, it's not something that's nice to have, but we really feel like this is a fundamental concept that we need to be teaching our students everywhere, from the United States to Malaysia. It's worth repeating, information really is the foundation for civic engagement and action. Students live in a very complex information landscape. Twitter, Facebook, Google, Snapchat, Instagram. None of these things existed when I was a student. When I was 15 years old, there was none of this. My information landscape was much, much smaller. If I came across a piece of information that called itself news, it probably was. I didn't have to think about that. Today, obviously, that's not the case. So we have to teach students for the information landscape that they live in, not the one that we grew up in. It's really important for us to prepare them to be able to understand the information world around them, because this is how they're going to make choices. And if we don't do it, it's very unfair to the students because they won't be able to make decisions, informed decisions. And this is really what we want students to be able to do. So let's talk a little bit more about news literacy. Ultimately, it's the ability to understand and determine whether or not a piece of information is credible, whether or not you should believe it, as well as the accuracy, the credibility of the source of that information. As we see this very funny meme on the right here, there are going to be some small subset of people who might believe that, right? This is the sort of information that or misinformation that we're coming across on a daily basis. But being able to tell that this isn't real, right, is important, right? In this case, it's probably pretty easy, and I would suspect the vast majority of your students would be able to tell that this isn't real. But that skill of being able to tell the difference between something that's true and something that's false is really the key skill for the 21st century. And so we have to teach our students what the standards of journalism, what the standards of high quality information should be, so that they can recognize those standards when they come across a piece of information, but also so that they can recognize when those standards are missing, and so that they can be warned and understand it when they see something that calls itself news, but doesn't include many or most of these standards, that maybe it's not news, and maybe they shouldn't trust it, and maybe they shouldn't believe it. Ultimately, students have to understand and appreciate the role that journalism and high quality information plays in protecting the interests of citizens, protecting the interests of society, and holding powerful institutions to account. This is a really key aspect of getting students to engage with high quality information. They have to understand the value of that information. So ultimately, news literacy is really about helping students understand what's real and what's not, because this is what's going to help them make the most important decision that they can make as a citizen is whom to vote for, what party to support, what policies to support. If they're making those decisions based on manipulated information, based solely on propaganda, then they might make choices that ultimately go against what they really want. And that's obviously a sign that democracy isn't working and functioning properly. The key way for us to do that is to ensure and make sure that students really understand the difference between news and opinion, right? This is what I would say is the first step in teaching students to be critical consumers of information. And the challenge and the problem is that right now, especially on social media, it can be very hard to tell the difference between news and opinion. Not everyone understands that, and you're not going to understand it unless you're taught it. So it's important for us to actually teach our students what these differences are. So I'm sure most of you understand and appreciate these differences, but it's very important for us to communicate this as much as we can to our students, that news is a type of information whose goal is to inform the public through fair and accurate reporting. That's the goal of journalism, or should be the goal of journalism, and high quality information. And news uses these standards, things like verification. As a journalist, when I report something, I have to make sure that it's accurate. I have to make sure that it's correct before I publish it. I have to make sure I have high quality sources of information. If I call up my mother and say, hey mom, what do you think an effective coronavirus cure is? My mother's not a doctor. My mother's not a public health expert. That's not a particularly good source of information for that story. As a journalist, it's important for me to be fair. I have to make sure if I'm accusing someone of something that I give them an opportunity to respond. I have to make sure that the accusations are accurate, that they've been verified before I make them. As a journalist, it's really important for me to be accountable and to be transparent. If I have a potential conflict of interest, I should disclose that to my readers or viewers. If I get something wrong, I should correct it, and I should explain how the mistake happened. This is incredibly important. And of course, journalists need to provide context. You need to, we're not there simply to say what happened, when it happened, where it happened. Part of what journalists do is try to also explain why things happen. And so to help our viewers and our readers and our listeners have a full understanding of the events that transpired. Opinion is very different. Opinion is trying to persuade you. It's presenting a very specific point of view, and it's trying to persuade you to believe something about something. So while there is there can be a lot of interesting and important information that comes out of opinions or opinion-based arguments, it's important for us to recognize that people who are promoting opinion-based arguments aren't necessarily trying to give you all the information that you might need to make up your own mind about a subject. They're trying to point you in a particular direction, and they often will leave out information which challenges their point of view. So just helping our students understand these two very fundamental things, the differences between these two types of information, can really help them seek out and consume higher quality information. Two things that are really helpful, I think, for us to do as teachers and educators is to help students understand the media around them. So the difference between different types of media, the difference between different types of information. What is journalism? What are the standards of journalism? Why? What role do journalists play in our society? And then help give them the skills to really interpret and understand the information that they come across, especially on social media. It's not realistic, I think, to expect students after they, get some media literacy education or news literacy education to say, okay, now I'm only going to read high quality sources of information. I'm going to subscribe to my local newspaper. I'm only going to read the BBC or my local national newspaper. That's unrealistic. Students are still going to be on TikTok. They're still going to be on Instagram. They're still going to be on Facebook. We have to teach them how to understand information within the context of social media. That's really important. And we need to move more quickly. And that's what you guys are doing now by doing this professional development. And this is really, really important to help our students because they need help now. In a few years, your students are going to be voters. They're going to be hopefully maybe going off to university. They might be getting their first jobs. They might be starting families. They need to be able to understand the information around them so they can make smart choices. So part of what happens when we help students feel confident, when we help students be able to navigate this very complex information landscape, they don't just want to consume information. They want to analyze it. They want to be critical of it. And this is really important, but it also motivates them to learn. It motivates them to become more connected to their communities. One of the things that we've seen in our work is that students who go through news literacy education tell us that they are more likely to vote and become civically engaged once they're old enough to do so. And that's not something that we teach. We don't teach them and tell them they have to go out and vote, but just being able to understand information makes students want to be more engaged with the society around them. So helping them understand the importance of being critical in your consumption of information, seeking out high quality information is really one of the essential keys to getting your students to become more engaged with their society, getting them to become voters, getting them to become informed voters. This is ultimately how democracy functions at its highest level. So we really feel that you have a really important role to play with that. And I look forward to hopefully hearing about how this plays out in your classrooms. So one of the most important things that you can do as a teacher is not just teach this information and these skills to your students, but also to model these actions in your own lives. Make sure that you're doing what you ask your students to do. Check your sources before you share, making sure, taking a minute to or a moment to really understand what you're sharing. And also, if you come across misinformation, to challenge that misinformation, to debunk it. And to really stand up for the idea that facts exist. Because without facts, ultimately, we can't have a functioning democracy. We can always disagree about how to interpret facts. But unfortunately, right now, especially on social media, there is a movement of people who don't believe in the idea that any fact that contradicts what they believe is legitimate. And that's a very dangerous place to be in a society that depends on different people and different interests being represented. We have to find some common ground in order to function as a society made up of different types of people. So with that, I'm gonna end there, and I think we have some time to chat and to talk about some of the topics that I brought up. Obviously, in 20 or 25 minutes, it's impossible to talk about everything. As David knows, we've been doing these 2-hour sessions on individual slides that I mentioned here. But I really hope that this little presentation is the beginning of a journey for you as educators to more deeply engage with this idea and engage with this topic. And I think I'll be seeing all or some of you tomorrow to talk about this a little bit more. And you'll be learning more, I think, from some of your colleagues who have done some of the professional development events that we did a few weeks ago.
All right, thank you so much, Damaso. It was a really, really good talk. Guys, don't worry. Damaso will be with us the entire day tomorrow. He'll be with us for 3 hours tomorrow.
Hold on a second.
Yep.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, now I can hear you. Sorry, my settings were off.
Yeah, I'm just telling them that they're gonna have 3 hours with you tomorrow to learn more from you. But let's just take some quick question from the audience. So we have one from Chuck. Chuck is actually one of our media mentor. He asked, what's the best way to educate an under 20 in the difference between news from CNN and news from a YouTuber?
So that's a great question. So I think the first thing is we want to teach students just about the differences between high quality information, low quality information, difference between news and opinion. Now, one of the things that's important to recognize about CNN and any other news organization, the New York Times, the BBC, is that not everything you see on a news channel or in a newspaper or on a news site is news. Sometimes there is opinion. There's almost always advertising. So helping students to recognize that, because sometimes I would turn on CNN and it's somebody telling me what they think, not what they know. So that simple beginning from a place of the difference between news and opinion is very important. And then introducing them to this concept of what the standards of quality journalism are. So if you see a CNN news report, it should have many of these standards we've talked about, transparency, accountability. So for example, when you see a CNN report, you'll see a reporter and they'll often be talking to a camera and there'll be a little chyron underneath that'll give the reporter's name versus perhaps somebody on YouTube who is anonymous and doesn't give their identity. Transparency, right? If I say something as Damaso Reyes, the journalist, people can hold me accountable and say, hey, Damaso, you got that fact wrong. And my reputation would suffer if somebody exposes me for knowingly publishing something that's false. If I'm anonymous, nobody can hold me accountable. So if we're looking at, a YouTube report, does it verify information? Does it have sources that we can independently check? Or does that person simply say, people tell me, or everyone knows, or the government is hiding things? Teaching students about this kind of language, being able to recognize these differences between what high quality journalism does and how it manifests itself versus people who don't uphold those standards, and why that's useful or important.
All right, I think we only have time for one more question, so I'll present both questions and then Damaso, you can choose one to answer. Tomorrow, guys, we're gonna have 3 hours with Damaso. Maybe we can slot in like 10 minutes for Q&A tomorrow, so we can address the question that was answered. So the two questions are, Damaso choose one to answer. The first one is from Emily. What are some of the best practices of media literacy education in the United States classrooms or schools that you have seen or heard of? That's the first question. Second question is from Humi. Humi asked, in journalism, do we report about the act itself or the action, the intention of the act? So there are two questions here, so choose one to answer.
Yeah, so the first question I think we'll spend some time talking about tomorrow. Obviously, I think the work that the News Literacy Project does is really great, and there are lots of resources there. So I would highly recommend going to the website and having a look around. But in journalism, since I'm a journalist, I think I can talk about it. We we definitely talk about the act, because usually the act is something we understand and maybe we've witnessed or maybe there's documentation of. Intention is harder. Unless someone tells you why they did something, oftentimes it can be hard to accurately say why they did something. Now, that's not always the case. There are times when there are other indications why someone might have done something, and that's part of your job as a reporter. But as a journalist, you only want to communicate things that you know are true and you know are accurate. So it's really hard to do that sometimes when it comes around intention or motivation. I'll give you a really quick example. For many years in American media, there was a discussion about whether or not when former President Trump would say something that we as journalists knew was false, should we say that he lied? And the discussion became a little bit semantic, but it was really about, well, do we know that he knows that it's false when he's saying it? And that, I mean, it sounds kind of petty or kind of silly, but it's actually an important thing, right? Because as we know with misinformation, sometimes we believe the thing that's false is true, and that's why we share it. So a lot of news organizations would not say that the president is lying. They would say the president said something that's false, because we can't fully understand the intention without him saying, like if President Trump said, yes, I said that, and I knew it was false, but I said it anyway, then you could responsibly report that he was lying when he said that. But usually it's not that easy. It's a much more challenging. So it's something that journalists struggle with, I think, quite often.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting example. I think that's definitely something that the journalists have to really think about, is he lying or not? Yeah. So before we go on to the next session, I want to thank Damaso for being here with us today for the opening keynote speech. Just before you go, just have one quick photo with you, virtual photo, and then we'll break for 3 to 4 minutes. All right, so that's everyone on their camera. We're gonna take a screenshot. We're gonna take photo with